The subway rattled through the dim tunnels, its fluorescent lights flickering ominously. An elderly woman clutched her bag tightly, her frail hands trembling as a menacing young man loomed closer, his taunts echoing off the metal walls. The crowd watched in silence until Snoop Dogg stood up and changed everything. Before we dive into this gripping story of Snoop Dogg's courage and justice, comment below where you're watching from today. And if this tale inspires you, don't forget to subscribe. Snoop Dogg sat quietly on a worn plastic seat, his hoodie pulled low over his face, shielding his famous features from prying eyes. For the first time in what felt like months, he was just another commuter on a crowded subway train. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the rails blended into a monotonous hum, drowning out the faint chatter of passengers around him. The air was thick with the smell of metal, stale leather, and a hint of fast food from a discarded wrapper under a nearby seat. In the dim fluorescent light, Snoop leaned back, letting the mundane environment of the subway car wash over him. He hadn't felt this invisible in years. No cameras, no fans, no autographs, just the ordinary anonymity he had longed for amid the chaos of fame. For once, he savored the quiet, mundane life of the city. At the next station, the train lurched to a halt, the screech of the brakes jolting some passengers awake. A new wave of commuters boarded, filling the car with bustling energy. Among them was a woman in her late 60s, Clara. Her movements were slow but deliberate as she carefully maneuvered her way inside, clutching a large, overstuffed handbag to her chest. Her face, framed by a few strands of graying hair, reflected exhaustion, but her posture exuded resilience. Clara's eyes scanned the crowded car, searching for an empty seat. Most passengers, absorbed in their phones or pretending to sleep, avoided her gaze. She hesitated in the aisle, a quiet plea evident in her posture. No one moved to offer her a seat. Snoop's eyes, barely visible under his hoodie, followed her movements. His jaw tightened as irritation bubbled within him. He considered standing up to give her his seat, but before he could act, a figure caught his attention. A young man in a gray hoodie, his face partially obscured, stepped forward. At first it seemed like he might help Clara. Snoop's tension eased slightly. Maybe there were still decent people around. But as the young man spoke, his intentions became clear. "Move it, Grandma," he sneered, his voice sharp and mocking. The words cut through the ambient noise of the train, drawing the attention of a few passengers. Clara froze, her eyes wide with surprise. "Excuse me," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I said, move," the young man barked, stepping closer. He shoved her lightly with his shoulder, forcing her to stumble back. Gasps rippled through the car, but no one intervened. Snoop's fingers twitched under his hoodie. Every instinct screamed at him to stand up, but he held himself back, observing the scene unfold. The young man chuckled, looking around as if seeking approval. "Look at this old bag," he jeered, turning to the crowd like a comedian on stage, dragging her whole house around in this ugly bag. "What's in there, Grandma? Rocks?" A few passengers laughed nervously, their faces pale and uncertain. Others stared intently at their phones, unwilling to get involved. Clara's knuckles turned white as she clutched her bag tighter, trying to edge past him. "Please," she whispered, "I just want to find a seat." The young man stepped in front of her again, his grin widening. "You deaf, Grandma? I'm talking to you," he shouted, shoving her harder this time. Clara stumbled into a nearby pole, her bag slipping from her grasp and landing on the floor with a heavy thud. Her face crumpled in disbelief and humiliation as she reached down to retrieve it. Snoop sat motionless, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. He glanced around the car, silently pleading for someone to step in. There were at least 20 people in the car. Young men, adults, even women, but none of them moved. Clara bent down to pick up her bag, her hands trembling. The young man crouched down at the same time and yanked it away from her. He held it up high like a trophy, his grin triumphant. "Give that back," Clara cried, her voice cracking. "That's mine." "Oh, now you've got something to say, huh?" the young man taunted, shaking the bag mockingly. "Too late, Grandma. Should have spoken up sooner." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes as she reached for the bag, but the young man pulled it away, laughing. Around them, passengers continued to sit idly, some recording the incident on their phones. Snoop's hands clenched into fists beneath his hoodie, He felt the weight of his inaction pressing down on him, a disgust that went deeper than anger. He wasn't just disgusted with the young man or the apathetic passengers. He was disgusted with himself for waiting, for testing these people's morality instead of acting. Enough was enough. Snoop stood up slowly, his tall frame commanding attention even in the crowded car. His hood remained low over his face as he took deliberate steps toward the young man. The air in the subway car grew heavy as Snoop Dogg moved with purpose through the crowd. His movements were unhurried but deliberate, his presence magnetic. At first, no one seemed to notice him, their eyes glued to the spectacle of the young man taunting Clara Rivers with her own handbag. But as Snoop approached, his towering figure began to draw attention, the tension in the room shifting like a storm cloud about to break. The young man swung Clara's bag back and forth like a pendulum, chuckling to himself. Clara reached out one last time, her hand trembling as she pleaded, "Please, just give it back." The young man sneered. "What's in here, huh? Secrets? Grandma's $1 million jewelry?" He laughed loudly, looking around for approval. Some passengers chuckled nervously, unsure whether to join in or look away. Others kept their eyes glued to their phones, recording but refusing to act. Snoop stopped a few feet away from the young man, his broad shoulders squared and his hood still casting a shadow over his face. His voice, low and sharp as a blade, cut through the commotion. "That's enough." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of unshakable authority. The young man froze mid-swing, his grin faltering as he turned to face the source of the interruption. His eyes narrowed as he sized up Snoop, his bravado flickering like a weak flame. "What'd you say, old man?" Snoop didn't flinch. Instead, he took another step closer, his movements calm but calculated. "I said, put it down. Now." The young man's cocky smirk returned, though it was noticeably weaker this time. He tilted his head, feigning amusement. "Who do you think you are? Some kind of hero?" Snoop reached up slowly, pulling back the hood just enough for his face to be visible. Recognition flashed across the young man's face like a slap. His smirk vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. "Oh man, no way, you're put it down," Snoop interrupted, his tone unwavering. Silence fell over the car. The laughter stopped, the nervous whispers died down, and even the sound of the train's wheels seemed distant. All eyes were on Snoop now, the weight of his presence suffocating any remaining defiance in the young man. The young man hesitated, glancing around for support, but found none. The passengers who had been smiling moments ago now averted their gazes, unwilling to get involved. Even the man who had been smirking at Clara earlier now buried his face in his newspaper. "All right, chill," the young man muttered, raising his hands in mock surrender. "It was just a joke." He crouched down and placed the bag on the floor, sliding it toward Clara with his foot. Clara bent down slowly, her hands shaking as she picked it up. Her eyes met Snoop's for a brief moment, filled with a mix of gratitude and lingering fear. "Now apologize," Snoop said, his voice as cold and unyielding as steel. The young man frowned, his lips curling in frustration. "Come on, man, I said it was a joke." "Apologize," Snoop repeated, taking another step forward. The young man swallowed hard, his face pale. "Fine," he muttered under his breath, barely audible. "Sorry." Louder, Snoop snapped, his eyes narrowing. The young man's shoulders sagged as he raised his voice. "I said, I'm sorry, all right." Satisfied but still watchful, Snoop stepped back, his gaze never leaving the young man. "Good, now get on the ground." The young man blinked, confused. "What? You heard me. Face down. Hands behind your head." The command was so unexpected, so absolute, that the young man didn't even argue. Slowly, he lowered himself to the floor, his movements stiff with humiliation. He lay face down, his hands clasped behind his head as instructed. A whisper spread through the car like wildfire. "Is that really Snoop Dogg?" someone murmured. "What's he doing here?" Snoop ignored the whispers, his attention locked on the young man. He glanced at the crowd, his voice firm but calm. Someone called the police. The passengers exchanged nervous glances, but no one moved. Snoop raised his voice, sharper this time. "I said, call them." Finally, a man in a suit at the far end of the car cleared his throat and pulled out his phone. "Yeah, I'm calling," he muttered, his tone reluctant. Snoop gave a single nod, then turned back to Clara. She had taken a seat near the back of the car, clutching her bag tightly to her chest as if it were a lifeline. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. her expression shifting from fear to quiet strength. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Snoop didn't respond with words. He simply nodded, his gaze softening briefly before returning to the young man on the floor. The subway car rattled forward, the metallic clang of the doors sealing them off from the outside world. For a moment, the car was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the train. The passengers sat in stunned silence, their phones clutched tightly in their hands. Some still recorded, but their expressions were no longer amused. They were wary, almost reverent. As the train neared the next station, the faint sound of police sirens echoed in the distance. The young man's breathing grew shallow, his body tense as the reality of the situation sank in. Snoop's stance remained unyielding, his eyes fixed on the young man like a predator watching its prey. The intercom crackled to life. "Next stop, Harborview Station. Please stand clear of the doors." Snoop glanced at Clara. Her eyes met his once more, and this time there was a glimmer of hope behind her tears. She wiped her face with a tissue, her hands still trembling but steadier than before. The train slowed to a halt, the brakes screeching as the doors slid open. A rush of cool air filled the car, and with it came the sound of heavy footsteps. 4 uniformed police officers stepped into the subway car, their faces sharp and focused. Their eyes immediately locked onto the young man on the floor. Snoop didn't flinch. He gestured toward the young man with a nod. "That's the one. Tried to rob her," he said, pointing toward Clara. "Shoved her, grabbed her bag, and wouldn't stop until I stepped in." The lead officer, a tall man with a buzz cut, stepped forward and pulled the young man to his feet. "All right, on your feet," he barked. "Man, I didn't do anything," the young man protested, his voice shaking. "Tell it to the judge," the officer snapped, twisting the young man's arms behind his back and securing the handcuffs with a sharp metallic click. As the young man was escorted off the train, a collective exhale rippled through the passengers. The tension that had gripped the car began to ease, replaced by a heavy, reflective silence. Clara looked at Snoop, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Thank you." Snoop gave her a small nod, his expression unreadable. As the train doors closed and the rumble of the tracks resumed, he returned to his seat. The weight of the moment settled over him like a heavy blanket. But for now, the injustice had been stopped. The train's steady hum filled the car as it jerked forward, leaving the station behind. Snoop Dogg sat back in his seat, his shoulders taut and his jaw set like stone. The young man's protests faded into the distance as the doors slid shut, but the atmosphere in the subway car remained tense, as if the walls themselves held onto the echoes of what had just happened. Clara Rivers clutched her bag tightly against her chest, her fingers trembling slightly. She was seated a few feet away from Snoop now, her frail frame barely taking up any space on the bench. The other passengers avoided looking at her or at Snoop. Their gazes were pinned to their phones or directed out the windows, pretending as though nothing significant had just unfolded in front of them. Snoop felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. It wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the heavy, uncomfortable kind, laced with shame and unease. These were the same people who had laughed at Clara's humiliation moments earlier, who had recorded her pain without lifting a finger to help. And now, they acted as if nothing had happened at all. "You okay?" Snoop's voice broke through the quiet, low and steady, as he turned to Clara. She blinked, looking up as though she hadn't realized he was still there. Her lips parted slightly before she managed a weak, "I think so." She adjusted her grip on the bag in her lap, her knuckles white against the worn leather. "It's not the first time, but thank you. Most people wouldn't have done what you did." Her words hit Snoop harder than he expected. There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger at the bystanders who had let her down, just quiet gratitude, tinged with a lifetime of enduring this kind of treatment. Snoop leaned back, pulling his hoodie down slightly to shield more of his face. "Shouldn't have had to," he muttered, his gaze scanning the other passengers. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes flicking toward him before quickly looking away. The train rumbled on, but the tension in the car lingered. At the far end, 2 teenagers whispered to each other, their phones clutched tightly in their hands. Snoop didn't need to guess what they were talking about. One of the boys raised his phone slightly, angling it in Snoop's direction as if trying to be subtle. Snoop caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. His patience, already worn thin, finally snapped. "Put that down," he said, his voice carrying across the car. The boy froze, his face turning red as he quickly lowered his phone. "Sorry," he mumbled, his friend elbowing him and snickering under his breath. Clara let out a soft chuckle, surprising Snoop. He turned back to her, raising an eyebrow. "I knew you looked familiar," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. Her eyes, still glistening from earlier tears, twinkled with a hint of amusement now. "You're Snoop Dogg, aren't you?" Snoop sighed, leaning back further into his seat. "Just a guy on a train," he replied, his tone even. But Clara wasn't deterred. "Well, Mr. Just a Guy on a Train, you've got quite a reputation," she said, her smile widening. "My grandson listens to your music, talks about you all the time." For the first time since he boarded the train, Snoop allowed himself a small smile. "Your grandson's got good taste." Clara laughed softly, the sound lightening the oppressive atmosphere in the car. It wasn't much, but it was something, a moment of normalcy in the wake of chaos. The intercom crackled to life, announcing the next stop. The train began to slow, the squeal of the brakes filling the air. As the doors slid open, a few passengers hurried off the train, casting quick glances back at Snoop as they exited. One man lingered near the door, his phone raised as he snapped a quick picture before darting out. Snoop's jaw tightened, his frustration mounting. He wasn't surprised. He'd been in the public eye long enough to know how this worked, but that didn't make it any less irritating. Clara seemed to notice his discomfort. "Don't let them bother you," she said gently. "People always see the flash, not the fight." Snoop turned to her, his expression softening. Her words echoed something he'd been wrestling with since the moment he stepped in to help her. This wasn't about him. It never was. The train resumed its journey, and the atmosphere in the car grew quieter, almost contemplative. The teenagers at the far end had stopped whispering, and the remaining passengers sat still, their gazes fixed firmly on their own laps. Snoop leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, his screen lighting up with notifications. Trending now, Snoop Dogg stops subway robbery. Hero in real life, Snoop Dogg saves elderly woman Na. He stared at the headlines, his jaw tightening. The video was already circulating online, with thousands of shares and likes pouring in by the second. People were calling him a hero, but that wasn't what he felt. Clara watched him silently for a moment before speaking. "They're going to turn this into a story," she said, her voice steady. "They always do." Snoop looked up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah, that's the problem." Clara tilted her head, studying him. "Then don't let them change the ending," she said simply. "It's still your story to tell." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Snoop nodded slowly, his mind turning over what she'd said. She was right. This wasn't about letting the world decide the narrative. It was about making sure the truth came through. The train slowed again, this time pulling into a major station. The intercom announced the stop, and the doors slid open with a soft hiss. A few more passengers exited, and new ones boarded, their eyes immediately drawn to Snoop. The whispers started again, quiet at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. Snoop adjusted his hoodie, pulling it lower over his face. He wasn't ready for the world to turn this into a spectacle, not yet. He had a feeling, though, that it was already too late. Clara reached out, gently touching his arm. He looked at her, surprised by the gesture. "You did the right thing," she said firmly, her voice leaving no room for doubt. For the first time in a long time, Snoop felt a sense of clarity. He nodded, his resolve solidifying. The world might watch, might twist this into something it wasn't, but he would make sure the truth was heard. The train rattled forward, carrying them deeper into the city. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Snoop knew this wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. The subway car felt heavier than it had moments ago, even as it rattled toward the next station. Clara sat a little straighter now, her bag gripped tightly in her lap and her posture steadier than before. Across from her, Snoop Dogg remained motionless, his presence still commanding the room. The tension was palpable, yet no one dared to break the silence. Even the faint murmurs and whispers from earlier had faded, replaced by a collective unease. The remaining passengers avoided eye contact, either pretending to be engrossed in their phones or staring blankly out the window. It was as though the weight of what had just happened pressed down on everyone equally, though no one seemed eager to acknowledge it. The sound of faint sirens began to echo from outside the subway tunnel, growing louder as the train slowed to a halt. The intercom buzzed, announcing the arrival at Central Plaza Station. The doors hissed open, and the cool air of the platform spilled into the car. For a moment, no one moved. Then came the unmistakable thud of boots stepping onto the train. 4 uniformed officers entered, their presence both reassuring and imposing. Their gazes swept over the car, assessing the situation with sharp efficiency. The lead officer, a tall man with a buzz cut and a name tag that read Rodriguez, stepped forward. His eyes locked onto the young man still lying face down on the floor, his hands clasped behind his head. "What's going on here?" Officer Rodriguez asked, his tone clipped but professional. Snoop stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, drawing the officer's attention. He gestured toward Clara, who sat silently clutching her bag, and then toward the young man on the floor. "This one tried to rob her," Snoop said, his voice steady but carrying a weight of authority. "Shoved her, snatched her bag, and wouldn't stop until I stepped in." Officer Rodriguez's sharp eyes flicked to Clara, who gave a small nod of confirmation. Her voice was soft but clear as she added, "He wouldn't leave me alone. But this man stopped him." She gestured towards Snoop, her gratitude evident even through her lingering fear. The officers exchanged glances before one of them stepped forward and hauled the young man to his feet. "All right, on your feet," the officer barked. The young man squirmed in the officer's grip, his voice rising in protest. "Man, I didn't do anything. She dropped the bag, and I just picked it up." "Tell it to the judge," Officer Rodriguez replied curtly, twisting the young man's arms behind his back as the familiar metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the car. The young man's protests continued as he was escorted off the train, his voice growing fainter as the officers led him down the platform. The doors slid shut behind them, sealing the passengers back into their bubble of uneasy silence. For a moment, no one spoke. The train jolted forward again, the metallic hum of the wheels filling the void. Clara looked up at Snoop, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Thank you." Snoop gave her a small nod, his expression unreadable. He sat back down in his seat, his shoulders sagging slightly as the weight of the moment settled over him. But the tension in the car remained. The passengers, though no longer staring at their phones, still refused to meet each other's gazes. Snoop could feel their unease radiating like static electricity. It wasn't just the shock of the incident, they were grappling with their own roles in it. Some had laughed at Clara's humiliation, others had recorded it, and most had done nothing at all. Now, in the aftermath, their silence felt heavier than ever. A man in a suit sitting near the front of the car cleared his throat awkwardly. That was brave of you," he said, his voice faltering. Snoop turned his head slightly, his eyes sharp and cutting. The man quickly looked away, his face flushing with embarrassment. Clara chuckled softly, breaking the awkward tension. "Brave, sure," she said, her tone light but carrying a hint of sarcasm. "But let's not forget, it shouldn't have taken bravery for someone to do the right thing." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply. Snoop glanced at her, a flicker of approval crossing his face. The train rumbled on, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly as the car swayed on the tracks. Outside, the dimly lit tunnels seemed endless, a blur of shadows and faint glimmers of light. A few seats away, a teenage girl nudged her friend and whispered, "That's Snoop Dogg, isn't it?" Her friend nodded, her eyes wide with recognition. The whispers spread quickly. Passengers began glancing in Snoop's direction, their expressions a mix of awe and hesitation. A few reached for their phones, subtly snapping pictures or recording short videos. Snoop noticed, his jaw tightening as his patience wore thin. He adjusted his hoodie, pulling it lower over his face, but it was no use. The whispers continued, growing louder as more passengers realized who he was. "Is that really him?" someone murmured from the back of the car. "Yo, that's Snoop Dogg," a man whispered excitedly, raising his phone to capture the moment. The attention was inevitable, and Snoop knew it. He'd lived under the spotlight for decades, But this time, it felt different. This wasn't about his music or his fame. This was about an ordinary moment on an ordinary subway ride, and he didn't want it turned into a spectacle. A teenage boy stood up, his phone held aloft as he approached Snoop hesitantly. "Hey, can I get a picture with you, man?" Snoop shook his head slowly, his voice firm but calm. "Not today." The boy's face fell, and he retreated back to his seat, muttering something under his breath. Clara watched the interaction with quiet amusement. "I don't know how you deal with it," she said, her tone gentle. Snoop let out a short, humorless laugh. "You get used to it," he replied, though his expression suggested otherwise. The train slowed again, the intercom announcing the next stop. As the doors opened, a few passengers exited, throwing furtive glances at Snoop on their way out. Clara leaned forward slightly, her voice low but full of quiet wisdom. "You know," she said, "they're not looking at what you did, they're looking at who you are. But that doesn't mean what you did doesn't matter." Snoop met her gaze, her words hitting harder than he expected. For a moment, he said nothing, letting her wisdom sink in. The train rattled forward, carrying them closer to their destination. And though the car was quieter now, the weight of the moment lingered, heavy and unshakable. The train barreled forward, its rhythmic clatter filling the silence of the subway car. The tense atmosphere from earlier had begun to shift, replaced by a different kind of unease. Whispers swirled around Snoop Dogg as more passengers connected the dots, their murmurs growing louder with each passing moment. "That's Snoop Dogg, right?" one woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swear it's him," another man replied, holding his phone discreetly, the camera pointed in Snoop's direction. Snoop felt their eyes on him, the subtle glances, the not-so-hidden phones capturing his every move. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, pulling his hoodie lower over his face, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Fame was like a beacon, impossible to dim once it was lit. Across from him, Clara Rivers watched the scene unfold. Though she had regained some composure, her hands still rested protectively over her bag. She tilted her head slightly, studying Snoop with a thoughtful expression. "You don't seem like you enjoy the attention much," she said softly, her voice cutting through the background noise. Snoop glanced at her, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Never been my favorite part of the job," he admitted. Clara chuckled, shaking her head. "Funny. You'd think someone like you would love the spotlight." Snoop leaned back, resting his arms on the edge of the seat. "Spotlight's all right when you can control it," he said, his tone calm but laced with frustration. "But moments like this, they're different." Clara nodded knowingly, her gaze flickering to the passengers who were still sneaking glances at Snoop. "They're not seeing you for what you did, they're seeing you for who they think you are." The words hung in the air, resonating deeply. Snoop nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in them. He wasn't just Snoop Dogg, the man who had stepped in to help Clara. To them, he was Snoop Dogg, the celebrity, the rapper, the icon, and that identity overshadowed everything else. The train slowed again, the screech of the brakes jolting some passengers out of their quiet whispers. The intercom announced the next stop, and the doors hissed open. A few passengers stepped off, glancing at Snoop on their way out, as if he were an exhibit at a museum. As the doors closed and the train resumed its journey, the whispers started anew. "Yo, that's really him," a teenage boy whispered to his friend, holding his phone up to record. "Think he'll sign something?" The other boy replied, his tone hushed but eager. Snoop caught their words and sighed. His patience, already wearing thin, finally snapped when he saw one of the boys raise his phone again. "Put it down," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the hum of the train. The boy froze, his face turning red as he quickly lowered his phone. Sorry," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. The interaction didn't stop the whispers, but it did quiet them for a moment. Snoop leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he tried to tune out the noise. Clara's voice broke through his thoughts. "You know," she began, her tone light but pointed, "you can't stop people from looking, but you can make sure they see what matters." Snoop raised an eyebrow, glancing at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" Clara smiled faintly, her eyes sparkling with quiet wisdom. "They're going to tell this story whether you want them to or not. Might as well make sure they get it right." Snoop let her words sink in as the train continued its journey. She was right, of course. The story was already out of his hands. Somewhere out there, someone was uploading the video, attaching captions and hashtags, spinning it into something bigger than it was. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out reluctantly, the screen lighting up with notifications. Breaking news: Snoop Dogg stops robbery on subway. Hero in real life: Snoop Dogg confronts thief. Trending now: Snoop stops crime. The headlines made his stomach turn. It wasn't the attention that bothered him, it was the narrative. They were turning this into a hero story, but that wasn't what it was about. "This ain't about me," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Clara heard him anyway. "Then tell them that," she said simply. Snoop looked at her, her calm demeanor grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. He nodded slightly, his mind already working on how to shift the narrative. The train slowed again, the intercom announcing another stop. The doors opened, and a rush of cool air filled the car. A few more passengers stepped off, and new ones boarded, their eyes immediately drawn to Snoop. The whispers started again, but this time, Snoop didn't react. Instead, he focused on Clara, her quiet strength giving him clarity. "You're right," he said finally, his voice steady. "If they're going to tell this story, I'll make sure they tell it the way it needs to be told." Clara smiled, her eyes softening. "Good," she said, "because what you did back there, it mattered. Not just for me, but for everyone watching." Snoop let her words settle as the train rattled forward, its rhythm steady and unchanging. Somewhere out there, the world was already forming its opinions, crafting its headlines, and sharing its takes on what had happened. But Snoop knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let this moment become just another viral sensation. He'd make sure the real story, the one about action, courage, and responsibility, was the one that stuck. As the train rolled deeper into the city, Snoop leaned back in his seat, his resolve solidifying with each passing minute. This wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what came next. The subway slowed to a screeching halt, its metallic brakes wailing as it reached yet another station. The doors hissed open, and passengers shuffled on and off, their movements hurried but subdued. Snoop Dogg remained seated, hood pulled low over his face, while Clara Rivers kept her bag clutched tightly in her lap. The atmosphere in the car had shifted. Though the immediate chaos was over, the tension lingered. Passengers were buzzing quietly among themselves, their phones lighting up with notifications as the world outside began to take notice of what had just unfolded. Snoop's phone buzzed again in his pocket. Reluctantly, he pulled it out, his eyes narrowing as he saw the endless stream of notifications. Bookmark. Breaking news: Snoop Dogg heroically intervenes in subway assault. Trending now: Snoop stops robbery. Watch the viral video: Snoop Dogg saves elderly woman. He let out a low sigh, scrolling through the notifications. His inbox was flooded with messages from his manager, his publicist, and even a few old friends he hadn't spoken to in years. "Manager: Snoop, call me ASAP. The story's blowing up. We need to get ahead of this." Publicist: "You're trending everywhere. Everyone wants an interview. What's your angle?" Random contact: "Yo, man, you're a legend for this. Respect." Snoop shook his head, a bitter taste in his mouth. It wasn't about being a legend or trending online. This wasn't supposed to be about him. Across the car, two teenage boys whispered loudly, their phones angled toward him as they scrolled through social media. One of them turned to his friend, his voice barely hushed. "Bro, it's all over TikTok already. Look at this. 2 million views in, like an hour." Snoop clenched his jaw, his patience fraying. He glanced at Clara, who was watching him with a mix of curiosity and understanding. "They don't stop, do they?" she said softly, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. Snoop smirked faintly, shaking his head. "Not when there's a story to sell," he muttered. Clara leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "Then maybe it's time you told it yourself." Her words hung in the air, clear and unshakable. Snoop considered them as the train rattled forward, its fluorescent lights flickering overhead. She was right. If he didn't step in to control the narrative, it would spiral out of his hands completely. His phone buzzed again, this time with a new headline. "Real-life hero: Snoop Dogg takes down thug on NYC subway." He let out a frustrated sigh, sliding the phone back into his pocket. It was always the same. The media would twist the story, magnify his role, and make it about heroism, about spectacle. But that wasn't the story he wanted to tell. The intercom buzzed, announcing the next stop. The train jolted as it came to a halt, the doors sliding open to let more passengers off. A man standing near the exit lingered for a moment, his phone raised as he snapped a quick photo of Snoop before stepping off. Snoop's jaw tightened as he watched the man disappear onto the platform. He glanced at Clara, who offered him a small, knowing smile. "Don't let them change it," she said simply, her words echoing what she'd told him earlier. "It's still your story." The train doors closed and the car lurched forward again. Snoop leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. If the world was going to talk about this, then he'd make sure they talked about it the right way. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone again and opened the camera app. For a moment he hesitated, staring at the blank screen. Then, with a deep breath, he hit record. The camera focused on his face, shadowed slightly by his hoodie. His expression was calm but resolute, his eyes piercing as they locked onto the lens. "By now you've probably seen the video," he began, his voice steady. "And I know what you're thinking. You're calling me a hero, saying I did something special. But I need you to hear this. This isn't about me." He paused, letting his words sink in. The hum of the train filled the background as his voice grew firmer. "The real story here is about Clara Rivers," he continued. "A woman who was just trying to get through her day when someone decided to make her a target. And the worst part, it wasn't just what he did. It was the fact that nobody stepped in to stop it. People laughed. People recorded it. But no one acted." Snoop leaned closer to the camera, his tone sharpening. "If you're watching this, I want you to ask yourself something. What would you have done? Would you have stepped in, or would you have looked away? Would you have pulled out your phone instead of your courage?" He let the silence stretch for a moment before sitting back. His expression softened slightly, but his resolve was clear. "I'm not a hero," he said firmly. "I'm just a man who did what needed to be done. But next time, it might be you on that train. It might be you holding that phone. Ask yourself, are you going to watch, or are you going to do?" With that, he ended the recording and uploaded it without captions, hashtags, or filters, just the raw truth. The phone buzzed almost immediately with comments and shares pouring in. "This is what we need to hear." Finally, someone said it. "He's right. We need to do better." Snoop placed the phone face down on the seat beside him, his eyes distant as the train carried him deeper into the city. Clara was watching him again, her expression warm but thoughtful. "You said what needed to be said," she remarked, her tone quiet but firm. Snoop nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Yeah," he replied, "but now it's up to them to listen." The train slowed once more, the intercom announcing the next stop. Snoop glanced out the window at the approaching station, his thoughts already shifting to what would come next. The world would keep talking, keep sharing, keep twisting the narrative. But for the first time, Snoop felt a sense of control. Not over the noise, but over the message. And that, he realized, was all that mattered. The city lights flickered in the reflection of the subway car's window as the train continued its relentless journey. Snoop Dogg sat back, his mind churning with the weight of the moment. His phone buzzed incessantly beside him, notifications piling up like a tidal wave. Each vibration carried more headlines, more comments, and more requests for interviews. He'd expected this. Fame always came with a spotlight, but this time, the glare felt different. It wasn't about music or movies or some stage performance. This was real, and it wasn't just his story. Across from him, Clara Rivers leaned against the window, her eyes half closed. She looked more at peace now, her bag clutched tightly in her lap as if it were a lifeline. Every so often, her eyes flicked open to glance at Snoop, quiet gratitude lingering in her gaze. The phone buzzed again. Snoop ignored it, focusing instead on the rhythmic clatter of the train. But Clara's voice broke the silence, soft yet firm. "They're all watching now, aren't they?" she asked, her tone light but knowing. Snoop glanced at her, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Yeah, they're watching. And what are they seeing?" she continued, tilting her head slightly. Snoop thought about it for a moment, then sighed. "Depends on who you ask," he said. "Some see a headline, some see a hero, but most of them? They're just looking for a story." Clara nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Then give them the right one," she said simply. Her words hung in the air, settling into the corners of Snoop's mind. The truth of it was undeniable. If he didn't tell the story, someone else would. And they'd twist it, bend it, make it about things that didn't matter. Reaching over, he picked up his phone. The notifications were endless. Calls from his manager, texts from his publicist, messages from friends and strangers alike. He scrolled through them briefly, shaking his head at the barrage of headlines. Snoop Dogg, real-life action hero. Snoop stops subway robbery, goes viral. From rapper to savior, the transformation of Snoop Dogg. It was all wrong. None of this was about him. His thumb hovered over the camera app, his mind racing. If the world was going to talk about this, then it was time they heard the truth. Straight from him. He tapped the app, the screen shifting to show his reflection. His face, partially shadowed by his hoodie, stared back at him. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled his hood back slightly, revealing his unmistakable features. With a deep breath, he hit record. "This is Snoop Dogg," he began, his voice steady but firm. "By now, you've probably seen the video, you've read the headlines, and if you're watching this, you're probably wondering what happened." He paused, his gaze locking onto the camera as if staring directly into the eyes of his audience. "Let me tell you what didn't happen," he continued. "This isn't about me being a hero. This isn't about fame or recognition. This is about a woman named Clara Rivers." He turned the camera slightly, focusing on Clara for a brief moment. She blinked, surprised, but didn't shy away. Her presence in the video was brief, but it was enough. Snoop turned the camera back to himself, his tone growing sharper. Clara was harassed, disrespected, and robbed on that train. And the worst part? Nobody stepped in. People watched, people recorded, but they didn't act. His jaw tightened, the emotion in his voice raw and unfiltered. "That's the real story here. Not me. Not some headline. It's about what happens when people see something wrong and decide it's not their problem." He leaned forward, his face filling the frame. "So here's my question to you. What would you have done? Would you have sat there, recording on your phone, or would you have stood up? Would you have done something?" Snoop let the question hang in the air for a moment, his gaze piercing. "I'm not a hero," he said firmly. "I'm just a man who saw something wrong and decided to do something about it. And next time, when it's your turn, I hope you'll do the same." With that, he ended the recording. No fancy edits, no captions. Just the truth. He uploaded the video immediately, his thumb tapping the post button without hesitation. The phone buzzed almost instantly, comments and shares flooding in. "This is the message we need. He's right. We all need to step up." Finally, someone said it. Snoop placed the phone face down on the seat beside him and leaned back, letting out a slow breath. The tension in his chest eased slightly, replaced by a quiet sense of clarity. Clara watched him, her expression softening. "You told them what they needed to hear," she said. "Yeah," Snoop replied, his voice low but steady. "Now it's up to them to listen." The train began to slow again, the intercom announcing the next stop. Snoop glanced out the window as the platform came into view, the bright lights of the station casting long shadows on the walls. Passengers began gathering their things, preparing to exit. Clara adjusted her bag, her movements steadier now, her hands no longer trembling. As the doors opened, a few people stepped off, some casting quick glances back at Snoop as they exited. But he didn't care anymore. The story was out there, and he had told it his way. Clara turned to him one last time, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Take care, Snoop," she said, her voice warm. "You too," he replied, his tone sincere. "Stay safe." As the train pulled away from the station, Snoop leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. The weight of the moment still lingered, but for the first time he felt a sense of peace. Somewhere out there, the world was watching. But this time, they were watching the right story. The morning light crept into Snoop Dogg's apartment, seeping through the edges of the blackout curtains like thin golden threads. The city outside was alive with its usual hum, car horns, distant chatter, and the faint clatter of trains in the distance. But inside, it was quiet, save for the persistent buzz of Snoop's phone on the bedside table. Groggy, he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the cool surface before pulling it into view. The screen lit up, revealing a storm of notifications. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, squinting at the overwhelming flood of messages. 56 missed calls, 300+ unread texts. The headlines were everywhere. "Don't watch, do" takes over social media. Snoop Dogg's message inspires a movement. From viral video to call for action, bookmark. Snoop swiped through the messages, scanning the comments and reactions. It wasn't just about him anymore. People from all over were sharing their own stories, moments when they'd chosen to act or stayed silent, their reflections raw and unfiltered. I saw someone being harassed once and didn't do anything. This made me realize I need to be braver. Next time I see something like this, I'll step in. Thank you, Snoop, for reminding us what matters. Don't Watch Do isn't just a hashtag, it's a wake-up call. The hashtag, originally unintentional, had become a rallying cry. Schools were organizing assemblies to discuss the message. Communities were planning events to promote active bystander behavior. The ripple effect was undeniable. Snoop let out a heavy breath, setting the phone down on the table. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as the weight of it all settled on his shoulders. What had started as a single moment on a subway had grown into something far bigger than he'd ever anticipated. A knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. It was loud and deliberate, followed by a familiar voice. "Snoop, open up, man. I know you're in there," Dre's deep voice called from the hallway. Snoop sighed, pushing himself up from the couch. He padded across the room, unlocking the door to reveal Dre standing there, phone in hand and an expression of amused disbelief on his face. "Man, you're everywhere," Dre said as he stepped inside, shaking his head. "Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, you've got the internet losing its mind." "Yeah, I noticed," Snoop replied dryly, closing the door behind him. Dre plopped down on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "You see the numbers? That video you posted has over 5 million views already. And the hashtag? It's trending worldwide." Snoop sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. "It's not about the numbers, Dre," he said, his voice low. Dre looked up, his brow furrowed. "Then what's it about?" Snoop met his gaze, his expression firm. "It's about them getting the message," he said. "This ain't about me being a hero or some viral video. It's about doing what's right, even when no one else will." Dre nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Well, you're getting through to them. People are talking, man. They're sharing their stories. You started something real here." The words hit Snoop harder than he expected. He leaned back, his mind drifting to Clara Rivers. He thought of her trembling hands clutching her bag, her quiet gratitude, and her unwavering strength. She'd been the spark for all of this, the reason he'd stepped in, the reason the world was now paying attention. His phone buzzed again, pulling him back to the present. This time, it was a notification from a news outlet. "Police update, subway suspect faces multiple charges." Snoop tapped on the article, reading through the details. The young man from the train had been formally charged with assault and attempted robbery. Witness statements, including Clara's, had solidified the case against him. Near the bottom of the article, a quote from Clara stood out. "I was scared. I thought nobody would help me. But then he did. He didn't do it for fame or attention. He did it because it was right." People need to remember that sometimes you just have to do what's right. The simplicity of her words carried a weight that no headline could replicate. Snoop stared at the screen, her voice echoing in his mind. "She gets it," he murmured to himself. Dre glanced over, raising an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Clara," Snoop said, holding up the phone. "She understands what this is really about. She's the real story, not me." Dre nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, but you're the one who made sure people heard it. Don't forget that." Snoop didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood, walking over to the window. The city stretched out before him, a maze of streets and lights bustling with life. Somewhere out there, people were watching, listening, and, hopefully, learning. He turned back to Dre, his expression resolute. "It's not about being in the spotlight," he said. "It's about making sure the right story gets told." Dre grinned, standing up and clapping Snoop on the shoulder. "And you did that, man. The rest, that's on them now." Snoop nodded, his focus sharpening. The story had been told, the message shared. Now it was up to the world to decide what to do with it. The phone buzzed one last time. A text from his sister lighting up the screen. "Proud of you, Snoop. You did the right thing." He smiled faintly, sliding the phone into his pocket. The movement wasn't just a viral trend anymore. It was a wake-up call for everyone watching. As the sun climbed higher over the city, Snoop felt a rare sense of peace. He had done what he could. And now, it was time to let the world take it from here. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Did it inspire you? Share your feelings in the comments. Drop a 1 if it resonated with you, or a 0 if it didn't. Your feedback helps us bring you more meaningful stories. Don't forget to share your own experiences too. And remember to subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Let us know what you think below.